one. Well, the only someone that can guarantee Ukrainian security is really NATO, and specifically the United States. Well, if the United States,
China?
no, that's not in the cards. The Chinese are not going to guarantee Ukraine's security. That's just too far-fetched. And furthermore, they don't have the military capability to do it. It's the United States and its European allies, right? But then Ukraine is a de facto member of NATO, and that's unacceptable to the Russians. So there's no way you're going to get a truly neutral Ukraine that's not affiliated with the West. It's not going to happen, and the Russians are not going to accept that. So what the Russians are going to do instead is they're going to create, if they can, a dysfunctional rump state. And that's what they're doing now. That's why they've taken all that territory, number one. And number two, that's why they're wrecking Ukraine.
What's quite frightening about what you're saying is that actually, if there is no deal to be done, and the logic is that the conflict will just carry on, and eventually more doubling down will
More
happen.
escalation.
More escalation. It seems from what you're saying that you think we are headed towards some kind of escalated conflict between the West and Russia. Whether that's nuclear or not, the logic would seem, if neither side finds the current status acceptable and both sides are refusing to concede, that a bigger, much more dangerous conflict is inevitable.
Inevitable is too strong a word.
Likely?
Is likely. That's correct. But I think your description of the present situation is right on the money. And the two outcomes that we have to worry greatly about are, one, where the Russians use nuclear weapons, right? And two, where the United States comes into the fight, or the West comes into the fight, because then you have a great power war. The United States and Russia are actually fighting each other. And as Avril Haines, the director of national intelligence in the United States, told the Senate this past spring, the most likely scenario for the Russians to use nuclear weapons is if NATO comes into the fight, right? So this is very dangerous.
So do you now think that some kind of nuclear event is likely?
Likely is too strong a word. The rhetoric I like to use is there's a non-trivial chance that nuclear weapons will be used here. And let me tell you why I think that's the case. If the Russians were to use nuclear weapons, the most likely scenario is that they would use them in Ukraine. And Ukraine does not have nuclear weapons of its own. So the Ukrainians would not be able to retaliate against the Russians with their own nuclear weapons. So that weakens deterrence. Furthermore, if the Russians use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, the West, and here we're talking mainly about the United States, is not going to retaliate with nuclear weapons against Russia, because that would lead to a general thermonuclear war. So the Russians...
Is that certain?
Pardon?
Is it certain that if the... So you think if Putin detonated an actual nuclear bomb within Ukraine, there would be no retaliation by the West?
No, there would be no nuclear retaliation. Macron has said that, by the way. We would not retaliate with nuclear weapons. The great danger is that if the Russians use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, right, that the West would retaliate with a massive conventional attack against Russian forces. David Petraeus, General Petraeus, has said that if the Russians attack with nuclear weapons inside Ukraine, we should take our conventional forces, NATO's conventional forces, and slam Russian conventional forces inside of Ukraine and Russian naval forces in the Black Sea. If we were to do that, we would then have a great power war. NATO would be at war against Russia. And as Avril Haines, the director of national intelligence, said, that is likely to lead to a nuclear war, because the Russians would not be able to stand up to the Americans and their allies.
So what would you be advising in the very unhappy event that Russia does launch some kind of nuclear strike within Ukraine, what do you think the wise response is?
The
from
wise
West?
response, and I think the likely response, is we would go to great lengths to immediately shut down the conflict. I think the use of nuclear weapons is what would shut down the conflict. It's the only possibility. I'm not saying that would axiomatically happen, but it would become so clear at that point in time that we were in danger of creating a nuclear war between the superpowers, that we would go to great lengths to shut it down. That would focus the mind in ways that are hard to imagine in the current context.
I mean, it's a risk that we hope we don't need to take.
But we're actually making it more and more likely. It's very important to understand that the more successful that NATO and the Ukrainians are at defeating the Russians inside of Ukraine and wrecking the Russian economy, the more successful we are, the more likely it is that they will use nuclear weapons. And again, you do not want to underestimate what great powers will do when they're desperate. I just give you another example to highlight that. In the summer, late summer of 1945, the United States had defeated Japan. Japan was finished in the summer of 1945. And the United States was unable to get the Japanese to surrender. And we felt that there was a serious possibility we would have to invade the Japanese home islands with amphibious forces. And given the casualties we had suffered at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the last thing the Americans wanted to do was to invade the Japanese home islands. So, given how desperate we were to avoid that outcome, invading the Japanese home islands, we were willing to drop 2 nuclear weapons on Japan. And of course, we were willing to do that because Japan had no ability to retaliate with its own nuclear weapons against us. The situation is somewhat analogous to the one that the Russians face in the circumstances where they are losing in Ukraine and they are becoming desperate. They could think about using nuclear weapons in Ukraine against Ukraine and not have to fear nuclear retaliation.